We're live. Good afternoon. Welcome to my Executive Member for Policy and Resources Decision Day. As far as I know, we don't have any deputations. Is that correct?
No, we don't, Leader.
So we can move straight on to the decisions. There's key decisions. The first is the annual core infrastructure grants to voluntary and community sector organisations. Are there any comments on that?
Yes, I would like to comment if I may.
Have you given me a notice of doing this?
Yes, I have.
Haven't you? Yes, that's absolutely right. Councillor Collett.
Just before I make my comments, have you introduced a new procedure where I need to give notice? Because when the executive member decision days were first set up in Ken Thornber's time, the opposition spokesperson was allowed to attend and speak on items as they saw fit. Perhaps it's something we can clarify outside the meeting.
I've probably taken the procedure that was adopted in children's services as being one that applied to other decision days as well, where I think it was, if I'm right, Louise, it's 24 hours notice, but I'm quite prepared to take that particular point offline, Councillor Collett, because you may well be right. I know that you're very good at actually checking up on these sorts of things, so I won't contradict you in any way if that's the case.
In my early days as a councillor, I got tripped up by procedure far too often, so now I make sure I know the procedure. But
I still get tripped up by procedure, I'm afraid, but not too often. Anyway, yes, sorry.
Yes, moving on to the serious business before us, which is the annual core infrastructure grants to voluntary and community sector organisations. It won't surprise you to know, Leader, that I can't support the recommendation that's before you today, and I hope I can persuade you to not go along with the recommendations that are being made to you. I think if you look back over the past 12 months at the phenomenal work that's been done by our councils of community service in terms of finding and harnessing volunteers and supporting so many different aspects of the process of handling the pandemic. And as we go forward with the current vaccination process, which will go on for many months yet and may be followed up by a third jab being necessary to deal with different strains of the COVID virus, and then an expected flu problem in the coming autumn, all being supported by volunteers and so on all over Hampshire. I think to apply to them a 10% cut in our funding to them just at this moment in time is entirely the wrong thing to be doing. It's the last thing they need to be having to cope with, even though outside of the pandemic they might have expected it. Equally, the things being done by Citizens Advice to support people in all sorts of circumstances they would not normally have found themselves in, to again be applying a 10% cut to our funding to them just seems totally inappropriate at the current moment in time. So I would urge you not to go ahead with these reductions in funding. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Collett. Are there any other comments about this particular item? Antonia Perkins with us?
Yeah, it's Rob Ormrod who's presenting.
Oh, it's Rob. Sorry, yes. Any comments from you, Rob?
No, I was just briefly going to introduce the report, but you've all obviously had the chance to read that. It does represent a 10% reduction from previous year's funding. It is in line with the budget reductions for all county council departments as part of the wider savings programme, and it also the report recommends that this funding is in place for 1 year, reflecting the uncertain financial context within which the county council is currently operating. Officers, namely the assistant chief executive, who liaise very regularly and monitor these grant arrangements, have been in discussions with the network of councils for voluntary service and Citizens Advice Hampshire about these proposed reductions, the programme for some time.
Okay, anything on the financial side or the John Coghlan, CEO.
Yes, Leader and Councillor Collett. I wouldn't want to get involved in any of the detail of any political argument about the report, obviously. But I would point out in the context of Councillor Collett's comments that the report concerns infrastructure grants. So these funds are largely administrative funds for the administration of by our voluntary sector colleagues. I absolutely concur with Councillor Collett's points about the work of our voluntary sector colleagues. But the truth of the matter is that we are faced with these financial imperatives ourselves, and we have to pass them on with regard to particularly infrastructure in order to make sure that more careful decisions can be taken where necessary with regard to direct service delivery. That's the only point I'd make, Leader.
Anything on the legal side at all? Financial?
No, nothing for me, thank you.
Well, look, in making the decision, I'm going to read out something that I prepared or was prepared for me beforehand, which may just give a little encouragement to Councillor Collett. It doesn't go along with what he wants me to do, but it's not totally negative. The report obviously outlines the value and the important work carried out by the voluntary sector across the council. And across the council, we provide a range of grants targeting specifically at various groups and activities. The grants provided to Community First Wessex and Citizens Advice Hampshire are, as the Chief Executive pointed out, to support their administrative infrastructure and not directly related to any grants that are made to individual groups. And as the County Council has been required to do over many years, we are asking them to look for efficiencies in the way they actually carry out those activities. And there have been occasions in the past where we've done this, and actually we have been welcomed by organisations for them, given the incentive to look more closely at their own organisations to see how they can run them more efficiently. We've consulted these organisations, and I believe that this will enable the County Council to reduce the grant by 10% in line with the reductions that have been made across departments of the Council. However, since the report was published, there have been a number of announcements in the budget that make impact on the work of the voluntary sector going forward. The Community Renewal Fund and the Community Ownership Fund provide opportunities to bid for government funding, which may place an additional burden on the voluntary sector. The County Council is keen to support local organisations in submitting bids to these national funds and will consult them around the best way to provide this support and to understand what resources they may need to maximise their chances of success. So I'm happy to agree the recommendations before me in this report, but with this added commitment to work with them on the new opportunities announced in the budget. While I've made these decisions, I'd also like to comment on a subject that relates to them and that's been mentioned in the media on a number of occasions recently. And that is why we can't use our reserves specifically to top up our revenue account. So I'm going to make a short statement because it does relate, as I say, to the decision I've just made. I continue to be concerned by the misinformation that circulates about our reserves. Total reserves stand at 643 million, but that is the context in the context of a county council that spends 2.3 billion in revenue and 200 million in capital every single year. 352 million, or 55% of our reserves, are fully committed to existing capital and revenue spending programmes, and a further 92 million is used by departments to invest in the transformation of services and to help deliver savings. 46 million is set aside to manage risks that we face, particularly as we operate a model of self-insurance and over 20 million represents reserves held on behalf of others, such as schools and the Enterprise M3 Local Enterprise Partnership. In reality, only 111 million of this, or 17% of our reserves, is truly available to support one-off spending, and most of this is already committed to supporting our savings programs, either by providing one-off cash flow support or through the corporate investment in IT systems. This represents the sensible use of funding that has been carefully built up over many years and has, for example, contributed to the way we've been able to manage COVID. And I would stress that point, having that ability to react quickly to events that in many cases overtook many councils across the country in managing COVID has been hugely useful. And although I've mentioned it before, I'll mention it again now, being able to provide money to care homes when they needed it most before we'd received the money ourselves from the county council is just one example of that ability to do that because the reserves were there. We've always resisted the temptation to use one-off reserves to meet revenue expenditure, as this is simply not a sustainable solution to the financial challenges we face. So that is the context that I make the decisions I've just made as regarding funding those two particular voluntary sector organisations. And now I move on to the second item, which is members' devolved budget, which is also in many ways linked to the first, and I'll explain why in a minute. I don't know whether you want to speak on that this item, Councillor Collett. I think you might.
Yes, if I may.
Yes.
Would you like me to speak now?
Yes, of course.
Okay. I think we're probably not a million miles away on this one from each other. It was really to try and help find a way that made sure this doesn't become controversial or difficult. I totally understand the importance with devolved budgets of having robust procedures in place. This is public money and it has to be administered properly and be seen to be administered properly. And therefore it is important that members declare their interests, and when there's any hint that there could be any sort of pecuniary interest involved, to take no part in the decision about particular grant applications. I totally support that and would be horrified if we didn't have that process in place. I'm a little concerned that referring all such declarations where non-involvement is necessary through to the leader of council is putting a burden on the leader that perhaps the leader won't always be too pleased to be receiving, particularly when it happens in January and February as the grant year comes to an end and we're trying to grapple with the council budget and so on. But
I understand your concern about my well-being.
Well, absolutely, and next year Keith House, of course. But the issue is where there are different political opinions, different political representations, that I think it would be helpful if the group leader for the councillor concerned was consulted with you, by you, as part of that process. I think that can take the difficulty and the sting out of any of these issues. And I think Barbara has said that there, well, I know Barbara has said that that doesn't cause any governance problems. It's just a matter of coming up with words to make that work. So yes, Chairman, I won't go on because we've covered it in email and you know the point, and I think we pretty much agree on the way forward on this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Collett, and also thank you for your suggestion, which I totally agree with. Yeah. And we will put it in place. I understand, and I'll defer to you, Barbara, legal advisor. You dropped me a note to that effect about consulting the leader of the opposition group, or an opposition group, I should say, before deciding exactly what should go forward as an alternative way of delivering a particular grant to a particular organisation. Barbara, do you want to say a quick word about that?
Yes, thank you, Leader. I think that's quite simple. I would suggest that and I can provide the wording of it, the recommendation after the word approved, where it's subject to additional wording in consultation with the relevant political group leader, after the words leader of the council, in those sections of the protocol entitled conflict of interest, and also I think in illness or absence of a member. I think it applies equally to both. There was an additional point which Councillor Collett raised with me offline, about what happens if a member feels that he does have an interest by virtue of, in effect, being a member of another authority or some other body. I think those situations will be extremely rare, and in fact, most of the personal interest would arise if they weren't to do with somebody's family or business or social connections. Would be because well, they would be outside the fact that a member is a twin hatter. Members are approving grants in their area. I think what we could do to cover Councillor Collett's other point would be just to include the words or where the member otherwise concludes he should not be involved in the grants process.
Yeah. Okay. Am I right in saying, Barbara, you're suggesting I change the recommendation itself, or do we just simply change Appendix 1?
I think we do both, Leader, but I can do that separately to the, if you're agreed with the principle of it. We change the recommendation, and then we just include an extra couple of bits of wording in the protocol itself.
Okay. Are you happy with that, Councillor Collett?
Entirely, Chairman. Yes, that seems a very sensible way forward.
Let's go forward. Let's do that. But I think just for sort of belt and braces, Louise, if I can make a note above my signature, electronic signature, to the effect that this matter is being dealt with in the way that's been suggested, and that at my next decision day, we just acknowledge the new wording so that it's covered legally. Does that sound like a good way forward?
Okay.
We can do that, Leader. Sorry, it's Barbara, but or we could just you could just agree the recommendation subject to additional wording in consultation with the relevant political group leader.
Okay.
And the second part, or where the member otherwise concludes he should not be involved in the grants process, because that will be the wording that I think covers the points made.
Well, let's do that. I'm just keen that we ensure that the audit trail shows the new amendment or the new appendix and not the old one, that's all. Yeah. But if that's all right. And on that basis, and with that addition, I agree the recommendation for this item associated with devolved budgets. I would just like to add, just to tweak Councillor Collett's tail slightly, that he will notice that we had originally decided some time ago to reduce members' budgets to £5,000. We found a way of actually bringing them back up to £8,000, which obviously gives him and many other councillors the opportunity of supporting their local charities when it comes to the work they're doing over COVID-19.
Well, hence the connection, yes.
Okay, and that completes my decision day, unless anyone thinks I've missed anything. Okay, Louise, should we switch off the